Good evening, everyone. My name is the Storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep with these horror stories from Bad Company. Before we begin, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so please leave a comment. When you're ready, settle in and unwind. I remember that stormy night when I got to my boyfriend's apartment, and he gave me a warm hug and helped me remove my jacket before bringing me to the living room where two other Eddie and I had been going out for about 3 weeks. And although he was well-liked because of his involvement in sports, I try not to let that affect me too much. I also knew that he could be quite forceful at times, but he hadn't shown me that side of him in our relationship. Friends Valerie and Rob were waiting for us, and I returned the warm greeting. I had hoped that some of Eddie's other friends would show up, but he explained that the rain had kept them from attending the meeting, so it was just the 4 of us. Eddie asked me how my day had gone after we settled down on the sofa. I told him that I had been at home doing nothing, and as I did so, I glanced over at Valer and Rob and saw that they were absorbed in their phones. I scowled a little because I thought that perhaps they felt excluded, so I whispered to him that we should include them in the conversation. He gave me a cheeky smile and then proposed that we play a game called Truth or Dare, but I rolled my eyes because it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but both friends seemed willing to join, so I finally agreed. First, we set some ground rules, no lies, and if someone couldn't complete the challenge or answer the question, they would have to drink. After that was clear, Eddie looked at everyone and asked if we were ready. We all nodded, and to be honest, I found the idea of what might happen amusing. Then we sat in a circle and started. Eddie was the first to challenge Valeria to drink water while upside down, which made everyone laugh when she ended up completely. After a few rounds in which I consistently chose the truth option, I decided to take a chance and choose a dare. However, I was shocked when Valeria challenged me to kiss Rob. I was shocked for a few seconds, but I saw that Eddie showed no reaction, so I assumed he didn't mind. So I went over to Rob and gave him a quick kiss on the lips after finishing my challenge. Rob then challenged Eddie to make a fool of himself in his underwear, and without hesitation, Eddie took a shot of vodka and ran off to complete his challenge. Went back to my seat with a sense of pride and a little adrenaline in my body, but then I turned to face Eddie and asked him, "What the hell have you done?" He was looking at me angrily, and I knew that something was wrong. "I'm just a game," I said, a little taken aback by his response, but that's when it got scary. I saw the look of fury on Eddie's face, but before I could say anything to him, he slapped me so hard that I fell to the ground, and he grabbed me by the hair, began pulling me along while yelling terrible things at me. Valeria stared at me with wide-open eyes as I screamed, and Rob tried to calm things down by saying, "Leave her alone, Eddie." "What the hell are you doing?" as he approached, but he didn't listen. He then quickly dragged me into his room, and I realized that I couldn't allow that to happen. I tried to get out of there as best I could, pleading with him to let me go, and yelling at him that it was all a game, but he was totally beside me. Rob decided to try to control Eddie by force. So he gave him a strong push and then a punch, which made him let go of me. As soon as I felt that he was free, I started to run towards the door desperately, feeling dazed, angry, and terrified at the same time. This was the most humiliating and terrifying moment I had ever experienced, and it was also the most terrifying. However, things were about to get even worse because Eddie would not listen to reason. That Eddie had such a violent and abusive side. As I was about to leave the house, I heard a commotion of banging and shouting behind me. I turned for a moment and saw Valeria crouching next to Rob, asking if he was okay. He was having trouble getting up. His lip was broken, and he was looking confused, but I didn't see Eddie with them. "We have to go," Rob said. I've never seen Eddie go this crazy. Then the kitchen door opened, and Eddie emerged brandishing a huge knife, and I felt everything stop. I was running as fast as my legs would carry me in an attempt to save my life outside while the rain continued to pour. As I crossed the lawn towards the pavement, my shoes slipped off my feet, nearly sending me to the ground face first, but I didn't stop. My breathing was erratic, and I felt like my heart was about to explode. I looked back again and saw that Eddie was only a few meters away from me, knife in hand, and as I ran crazily down the street, The gap between us was narrowing, which terrified me to no end. Seeing that Eddie was right behind me, I tried to run faster, but then I felt a powerful blow from behind, and we both fell to the ground in an instant. He caught me dead, so I ran as if my life depended on it, and it really did. I started to think that I really shouldn't have been with him at all because he was a complete psychopath. I was about to reach his mercy, and I could hear his footsteps echoing and the sound of his heavy breathing above the heavy rain. I kicked, hit, and even tried to bite him, but it was in vain. When I saw him raise the knife, I did the only thing I could do. I began to plead for my life. Then, with his teeth clenched, Eddie slowly lowered the knife and placed it to my throat. "Why did you do it?" he asked, pressing the cold metal against my neck. I repeated that it had only been a game, and I didn't feel anything for Rob, liar. He yelled at me as he raised the knife once more, and I closed my eyes, anticipating the pain that would soon come, the stab, but instead I felt his weight drop away from me, and when I opened my eyes, he was sitting next to me in the rain, the knife on the ground. I couldn't believe it, and he was staring at me with a terrified expression on his face, as if he had somehow realized what he was going to do. I wasn't sure if this was because he was a bipolar madman or out of regret, but I just cared that this was my chance to get away. So I leaped to my feet and ran to the closest avenue. I eventually took the first taxi I saw, and when I got home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I wondered if I was being too cowardly, but I really didn't want to relive that episode in any way. So I tried to forget it as if it had never happened. Eddie and I happened to attend the same university, so I occasionally saw him. But when I ran into him on campus, I simply turned away, and he did the same. There was a sort of... I grew up in a quiet, friendly neighborhood like the ones you see in movies, with white picket fences, dogs in every yard, and mothers taking their children to soccer practice. It was the ideal setting where everyone seemed to know one another. My mom was at home most of the time, looking after me and my younger sister Anna, who was a year younger than me. Like other girls in the neighborhood, we were involved in activities. I concentrated on sports, and Anna was an avid reader and belonged to a book club. From the outside, we appeared to be the perfect family. My mom made the best meals she could, and the flower arrangements she made for dinner, even on non-special days, added a warm and lovely touch to the house. However, there was something I never mentioned. My dad was a complete mystery. We never knew exactly what he did for a living, but we frequently saw him in a suit leaving early in the morning before the sun came up. And this story takes place just as we were planning to go on vacation, and I remember it very clearly. I woke up around 5 in the morning, full of excitement and unable to sleep, because we had a flight at 9 that would take us to the malls. I was tossing and turning in bed with anxiety, and when the sun started to rise, I decided it was time to get up because I thought the rest of the family would be there. He would return just in time for dinner, and his office on the second floor was completely off limits to us. Was still asleep, but I was completely mistaken. When I went downstairs, I heard my dad talking quietly in the kitchen. I walked over and overheard bits of their conversation. I told him, "I don't have time for this. I hired the guy to take care of it." He said in a frustrated tone, "I have a flight in a couple of hours. Don't make me go down there and do his job. You know how that's going to end." I didn't know what he was talking about, but the seriousness in his voice made me uneasy. "Make sure the candy is there, and everything." He ended the call with the words, "Be right there." I was intrigued and licked my lips, but then I noticed my dad putting on his jacket, knowing he was going to the car. I decided to follow him, so I snuck into the kitchen and then into the garage. As soon as I heard his footsteps approaching, I spontaneously got into the back of his SUV and hid under the seat because I wanted to surprise him and see where he was going. I was excitedly wondering what adventure awaited us. So after hiding in the car, I discovered that he was heading to a place called Destination Candy. I was giddy with anticipation, picturing all the candy I would be able to get, but I also had a little competition going on inside my head. I decided to follow Dad, laughing, thinking he'll never know I'm here, but before 5 minutes had gone by, I heard a sudden screech of brakes. What in the world was that asking Dad to look for something on the seat next to him at that moment? Understand what it was, but now that I'm older, I'm fairly certain it was a gun. I stayed put, so I peeked out from under the seat, and my dad almost jumped when he saw me. "I know you're going for candy, and I wanted to help you." I said with a nervous smile, "What candy?" He replied, "Yes, I heard you talking on the phone," looking confused and a little scared. I explained, and he relaxed a little. "Yes, sweets. Let's go to the store, but promise me you'll stay in the car," I said. Then we were on our way, and when we got to our destination, Dad made me swear once more that I wouldn't get out of the car. However, as the minutes went by, my excitement gave way to anxiety when I realized he wasn't coming back. I waited for 10 or 20 minutes, but he didn't come out, and the thought of sweets was starting to get to me, so I decided to go in and hurry my dad up. I opened the shop carefully, expecting to see a store full of suets, with staff members wearing brightly colored clothing and things like that, but instead I get chills just thinking about it. Dad was sitting tied to a chair with two dangerous-looking men around him. One of them had a gun and the other a baseball bat. His face was covered in bruises and blood, and the men were yelling at him if he thought he was a big shot. Every time he tried to defend himself, they hurt him more. I hid behind a box and watched the scene with tears streaming down my face. "You're going to die," one of them said in a threatening tone. "Give me the codes and don't make your family suffer, Dad." Terrified, he kept yelling to be excluded from this. "I'll give you the codes." Finally, he agreed, and he began to give them the information they required. Just before pointing the gun at his head, the man said, "That wasn't so hard, was it?" My eyes widened, unable to process what was happening. Suddenly, I heard a deafening shot so loud that I thought my ears would explode. I covered my ears with my hands and closed my eyes in an attempt to block out the sound. But when I opened my eyes again, I saw something that had plagued me for years. The men were laughing mockingly at my father's lifeless, bloody body in my nightmares, and his face was covered in blood. His blue eyes were open, staring into space, and there was a small hole between his eyebrows from which a lot of blood was coming out. My dad was dead, and I stood there paralyzed, waiting for the horror to go away, but it didn't. After the men had left, I finally dared to approach and started crying, embracing his body, his eyes open, but he was no longer with me. After a while, I left the scene. The next thing I remember is standing in front of my father's coffin at his funeral. Soon after, we moved across the country and tried to rebuild our lives. But even now, the fear and sadness of seeing my father dead in front of me never go away. The image still haunts me like a constant. I can't even remember how I got home. And everything that happened that day after my dad died has been completely erased from my memory. I'm Harry Wellington, and today I want to tell you about something that really affected me. When I was just 14 years old, in my neighborhood, there was a boy named Matt. His parents, Grace and Richard, were a little odd. They didn't talk to anyone else. Maybe that's why my mother has never wanted to tell me what happened during those 24 or 48 hours when my mind was off. Up until today, the only thing I knew for sure was that my father was involved in something shady, and he was keeping very bad company. My mom, Noah, and dad, Carter, have always been very affectionate with me, and we were a fairly close and happy family. One day, while I was playing with my toys, I heard shouting coming from Matthew's house. His parents' voices were clear, and you could tell they were arguing. "You can't give me anything," his mom was shouting, and it was the kind of fight that often resonated. In the neighborhood, except for us, it always seemed a little strange, but we never gave it much thought. In the neighborhood, Richard said, "I'm going to leave you if you don't change." She begged him not to say that. "What are you talking about?" They were that strange because our houses were so close that they occasionally came to pick us up. One day, as they were preparing to go on a month-long vacation, my dad asked them where Matthew was, and Grace said, "He's in the car." I felt that they weren't being totally honest, so I went over to the car to see Matthew. "Whose?" A silhouette appeared through the window, but when I arrived, I was frozen. It wasn't him. Instead, it was a doll the same size as him. I tried to tell my parents what I had seen, but they didn't believe me. Time went by, and one day, while playing with my friends Chris and Angela, I kicked the ball so hard that it rolled far away. Chris asked me to go find it, so I followed the ball, which appeared to be moving on its own. I was terrified and screamed so loudly that I lost consciousness and fainted when I woke up. Eventually, it stopped beneath a tree, but as I reached for it, I heard a strange, icy sound coming from above the tree. When I looked up, I was mesmerized to see a figure hanging there, its face looking terrible, as if it had been in a fire, with burnt skin and one eye hanging out of its socket. It looked like the ghostly image of a child with long nails trying to touch me with its hand. It was Angela's voice. She had brought me home, where I had a terrible fever that had gotten worse over the course of 2 days. On the third day, it was already night, and when I opened my eyes, I saw that the house was empty, with my dad in the bathroom and my mom in the kitchen. When I looked out the window, I saw Matt's house, and he was standing there, moving his lips as if he were trying to speak to me, but I couldn't hear him. So everything went through my mind again when I realized that he should have been on. Who was that boy staring at me from Matt's house window? I couldn't even comprehend what I was seeing when a woman suddenly showed up and repeatedly stabbed Matt with a knife. I couldn't believe what was happening, and blood splattered on the curtains. All I could think was, no, this can't be happening, but yes, I was watching it happen right in front of my eyes at the time when I was just 14 years old, and I wasn't sure how to respond to what I was seeing. Were so open that I thought they would burst out of my head, along with my heart, which was causing a hole in my chest from how hard it was beating. I rushed out of my room as quickly as I could, and I tried to tell my parents that something terrible had happened at Matthew's house, but all I got was disbelief. Eventually, they called the police, but they were unable to conduct a proper investigation because they had no more evidence than what I had seen while lying in bed with a fever, so nothing was heard from Matthew's family for 15 days. It seemed as though they had disappeared, but as the days passed, I started to sense a sort of shadow around me. It was odd, like someone was whispering in my ear, but I couldn't make out what it was. One night, I had a terrifying dream in which Mateo called me from a basement with a passageway leading to a secret room. I woke up sweating and my heart pounding, but I was determined to tell my mother everything, so I asked to go to Mateo's house. The following day, we decided to break in. The police had informed us that Mateo's parents had died in a car accident, but oddly, we knew nothing about it. It was all very strange. While my parents were searching the house, I went into the room I had dreamed about. I don't even know how I got there, just that I was shaking with fear. As I got closer to the door, a strange figure emerged from under the bed. It was short and thin, with long hair and red eyes that stared at me intensely, as if it wanted to eat my soul. The figure kept coming, but then I heard Matthew whispering that he had been there as if his spirit was trying to protect me. I thought, Harry, you're the only one who can help me in that moment. Panicked, I fled to the basement, and fortunately, my parents caught up with me just in time. We entered the room, and to my surprise, there was Matt's body. When the police searched the area, they discovered that he was still alive, but that he had been in a critical condition. So they took him to the hospital right away and are grateful for a few weeks. When I had the chance to speak with him alone after he had recovered from his coma, I told him what had happened and how I had been able to locate him. Matthew then told me a story that still makes me shudder. He claimed that the figure he had seen in his room was a constant presence in their home, something he saw constantly but had never spoken to. It was like a presence that had existed since before they moved in. In addition, he told me a very depressing story. His parents never loved him and that they had abandoned him in the basement before leaving so that he would die there from starvation and thirst. But then I remembered something and I wondered, if Matthew's mother hadn't stabbed him, then who was that figure I saw through the window? I told Matthew about it, but he had never seen a vision like this. So I just considered the possibility that it was the same figure I had seen in the room and ALS in the tree, but I was never able to identify it or determine whether it was a. I'm Marcus, 37, and I'm writing this as a form of therapy to convince myself that I'm not crazy. It all started with the death of my older brother Daniel, who was a complicated guy, but we always had a good relationship. According to the reports, he died of a heart attack, but I always had this feeling that there was something else. Child who had suffered a terrible fate in that house is just something that occurs to me, but maybe I'll never find out. Daniel always thought that the house where we grew up was haunted. After our mother died of what was supposedly a stroke, Dad continued to live there, convinced that her death was caused by something else. Daniel was very worried about his health, and there had never been any signs that anything could happen to his heart. It seemed odd to me that a heart attack could take someone so young and in such good health, but maybe it was just bad luck. Had my own issues, but soon after Daniel's death, I started to wonder if there might be more at stake. My dad asked me to go check the house because he was really upset, and I understood that. Even though I didn't want to go back to a place that had been abandoned for years, I agreed to help him. So one day, I made the decision to go. At first, the sun helped me relax. But as soon as I got there, I felt a strange chill in the air, so I started opening windows and cleaning a little and discovering old pictures. After a few hours of organizing the main room, I decided to take a break and explore the attic, which had always been a scary place for me. When I opened it, I was hoping to simply find memories that would help me deal with his loss. But what I read was terrifying. Daniel had been recording strange things that happened in the house, like noises at night, shadows moving, and that terrible feeling of being watched. The last page of the diary was torn, which made me uneasy because I thought that he didn't trust me. The last line specifically mentioned that this man was in the basement, which I couldn't ignore because that's exactly where my brother had died. So I went downstairs despite my growing anxiety. Initially, Daniel only saw him in his dreams, but he later claimed to have started seeing him even when he was awake in the house staring at him. I decided to take a closer look after finding a flashlight in a corner. Everything appeared to be fairly normal. Old boxes and furniture covering cobwebs, until I noticed a small crumpled piece of paper in a corner. At first, I thought it was just trash, but something told me it had something to do with what I was looking for. However, when I tried to shine a light on it, a chill went down my spine and the atmosphere became even more oppressive. The sensation that I wasn't alone in this place grew stronger, especially since the cellar door had been closed when we entered and it was obvious that no one had entered from the outside. I turned off the flashlight and stood there in silence, my nerves on edge, until I heard footsteps. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible, but as they got closer, my body tensed. And although I couldn't see anything in the darkness, my heart started to beat quickly. Without hesitation, I turned on my heels and ran toward the stairs, going up 2 at a time, hoping to leave behind everything I had read and experienced in that house and the basement. However, I knew this was only the beginning. As my heart raced and the sensation of being watched returned even more intensely after I closed the cellar door behind me. I knew I had to leave the house as soon as possible, but something stopped me abruptly, and I was overcome with dizziness. I was lying on the living room floor when I woke up, not sure how much time had passed, but it was already night, so at least 8 hours had passed. I was a little confused, but when I got up, I saw that I was still holding a small piece of paper that Daniel had torn out his diary. And by gently blowing on it, I could read what he had written. It was as if the entire house had fallen on me. And then my eyes closed, and before I knew it, I fainted. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I knew I had to trust him, so I ran to the front door without thinking. When I tried to open it, something locked it. And as I turned to look for another way, something that made my blood run cold came from the cellar's darkness. A head appeared, and there was the man with the hat, grinning at me. I wished I hadn't seen him now, because I couldn't move. It felt like an invisible hand was strangling. I dragged my feet back, gathering all my strength to escape and stand up, feeling that every breath was a challenge. The man approached slowly, enjoying my terror toying with me before the capture. I managed to get up to the attic, thinking that I might be out of his reach. And once I was inside, I tried to turn on the light, but it didn't work. Then, as if appearing out of nowhere, the man raised a hand and the room was filled with an icy wind. When I looked at Daniel's diary again, I saw an image I had never seen before. The man in the hat watching him and me when we were kids. He had always been there. He was responsible for my mother's and my brother's deaths, and now he was determined to get even. The man in the hat had appeared in front of me. He had not even had to climb the stairs. He had just appeared out of the shadows and was now grinning mockingly, enjoying my struggle to get away, to finish what he had begun with me. I decided in that moment of desperation that if I was going to die, I would do it my way. Knowing that this could be my last moment, I let out a sort of war cry and ran at full speed, throwing myself out of the window, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. I fell to the ground, running into some of the glass shards scattered around me. And I can honestly say that it was the most excruciating pain I have ever experienced. I broke my arm and my leg, but at least I was... As I lay on the lawn, I glanced up at the attic window again, and there he was, still grinning and taking in the scene. I was trying to take in everything that had happened when I got a call from the police telling me that my father had passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. I recalled the words on the paper Daniel had left behind, and I started to realize that my father must have made a pacto with that man in the hat to prolong his life at the expense of other people's lives. Naturally, I'd already lost my mother, and Daniel had been the first to fall victim to this cruel game. Now it was my turn, but I managed to get away despite everything that had happened. My days continued regardless of how hurt I was. But I made the firm decision to never go back to that house again because I knew that eventually someone else would occupy it. And I felt terrible for those people because I've always loved sleepovers. The excitement of spending the night away from home, sharing secrets, and laughing with my closest friends is just so rewarding. My name is Andrea, and I was 15 when I met up with my friends. I realized that the house already had an owner, but it would be too late. It all began as an innocent sleepover with friends, complete with games of chance and jokes between friends, until all of a sudden everything changed, and a night that was supposed to be pure fun swiftly turned into a true horror story, all because of an innocent joke. I usually get along well with my schoolmates, but there was one in particular, Tanya the hostess, who always made me feel uncomfortable. We all arrived at the house of one of our friends at around 7 o'clock in the evening with our rucksacks full of pajamas, suits, and board games. Her house was large, and her parents wouldn't be returning until the following day. So everything was ideal. It would just be the 5 of us having a good time and enjoying ourselves all night long without parents to restrict us. Habit of making offensive remarks about my appearance and saying things that made me feel horrible or foolish in front of other people. Don't get me wrong, among friends, we always joke around and laugh at one another. It's like healthy bullying, but in Tanya's case, it felt a little more intense. I felt like she was trying to upset me in some way, and I never knew how to respond to her hurtful remarks. So I usually ended up laughing nervously and quickly changing the topic to avoid making a scene. We began the evening with the usual girl sleepover activities after everyone got there, which included talking about the boys at school, getting our hair done, practicing the newest makeup trends, one of my favorite things to do at girls' sleepovers, and buying a ton of junk food to watch a movie. However, someone suggested that we play chase at home, which we all thought was a great idea. Little did I know that this seemingly innocuous suggestion would lead to one of the scariest nights of my life. For a long time, we ran around the house laughing and screaming while hiding behind furniture and cupboards. It was too funny at first, with 6 girls running around the house, chasing each other and laughing aloud. But gradually, I realized that Tanya was only interested in chasing me, and her advances grew more aggressive until she finally caught up to me and threw me to the ground with too much violence. It was one of those terrifying, real horror stories that you never forget. She used a lot of force that wasn't necessary or appropriate, and she hit me pretty hard. I stood there for a moment, gasping for air, feeling the weight of her body on top of mine, and then she whispered in my ear something like, "That's what happens to you, fatso, you can't run fast." This made me feel uneasy because, even though she said it in a mocking tone, almost like a joke, my friends could tell that she meant it, and they could sense the shift in the atmosphere, and the carefree laughter turned into tense silence. I tried to get up, but she kept me immobile on the floor. So I said enough is enough and tried to remain firm in my voice despite my growing fear. At that point, the others decided to step in and teach her a lesson. Through quick thinking and teamwork, we were all able to get her off me and immobilize her, though it was challenging because she was very strong and fought frantically. We were able to tie a rope, or rather, some makeshift strings, around her hands and legs. It took us nearly 20 minutes to restrain her, and by that time, as she was screaming hysterically for us to untie her. One of my friends told her that she would remain like that for a long time because she was being aggressive and a bad friend. At first, I wasn't sure if I completely agreed, but after seeing her tied hand and foot on the living room floor, we all backed away. The atmosphere was really strange because my friends were just as upset as I was about her behavior toward me. But we also knew that it had gone too far. Joke, but seeing Tanya tied up, there was a little unsettling, even though the girls eventually agreed that it was a form of discipline for her mistreatment of me. After the incident, we turned on the TV and began watching a reality show. At first, we were very aware of what Tanya was doing and kept our eyes on her because the girls had made it clear to her that they wouldn't untie her until she apologized to me. However, at one point when we were totally absorbed in watching the TV show when we heard Tanya's voice coming from the kitchen. When we turned around, we saw that she had moved beyond where we had left her. She was now untied, standing in the kitchen doorway with a large knife in her right hand and an almost demonic look of rage on her face. At that point, we all opened our eyes wide, and we heard her say, "Now you're going to regret it." At the same time, she ran towards us. With the knife raised high, panic struck immediately, and without hesitation, we all fled in different directions. 3 of the girls were able to enter one of the rooms, and I barely had the door closed when I heard Tanya's heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, yelling for us to come out and try to tie her up again. My heart was racing so quickly that I was certain she could hear it, so I locked the door and curled up against it before hearing Tanya. The girls on the other side were screaming and pleading with Tanya to stop her psychopath behavior, but she persisted in insulting them and repeatedly saying that she would kill them all as she pounded on the door of the room where my friends were imprisoned. It sounded like she was kicking it and striking it with a knife handle as well, because you could hear the sound of metal against wood. Anybody began to yell my name and threaten me, but she did so while hammering on the door of the room where my friends were, which led me to believe that she likely thought I was there as well. However, it didn't take her long to realize that I wasn't there, even though I didn't hear the girl speak to her. It's possible that she realized I wasn't there by not hearing my voice, and that's when I heard her footsteps again in the hallway, telling me to stop being a coward and to leave my current location, as she appeared to be checking each room. But she quickly realized where I was, so she went to the bathroom door where I was sitting on the floor in a complete panic. "Hey, Amy," she said. "Your voice sounded deceptively sweet. Why are you hiding? Let's play a little more." I didn't respond, and silent tears streamed down my face as I prayed for this nightmare to end. At one point, I tried to explain things to her. I asked her to calm down, telling her that she was acting like a crazy person and that she had exaggerated the situation too much. I also told her that if anyone, she should put the knife back where it belonged and stop playing around for a moment. I thought she would realize how out of control her behavior was and how exaggerated she was, but instead she began banging on the door again, this time with much more force and anger. It's as if what I said had made her even more irrationally angry. Tanya was banging on the door so hard that I was confident she would eventually manage to break it down She started saying that she would stick the knife in me until it lost its edge and that she wouldn't mind receiving a life sentence as long as it got rid of me from this world. She also stated repeatedly that she would finish you off, you fat. I must admit that I had never felt such panic in my life. I was terrified because based on her behavior, it was obvious that she was. I don't know how long I stayed curled up against the wall, trembling with fear and listening to Tanya's threats, but I was certain that she had some sort of mental illness that neither my friends nor I knew anything about. It was undoubtedly the most intense experience of terror I have ever had in my life. The hours passed slowly as I stayed in that tiny bathroom, the sound of the door banging alternating with periods of eerie silence. My mind racing as I tried to comprehend how it's simple. At one point, I must have fallen asleep, and when I woke up, I could see through the small bathroom window how the darkness of the night was gradually giving way to the light of dawn. Everything was silent at that moment, and for a moment, I thought that everything that had happened that night had been a simple nightmare, and perhaps I would have believed it if I had found myself in that situation. The sleepover had turned into one of those horror stories that we normally only hear about in the scary stories we tend to see on the internet. At one point in the early morning, I heard muffled voices from below. It was the other girls whispering to each other, probably as scared as I was. I wanted to scream for help, but I was afraid of drawing attention. So I stayed there and must have been so exhausted that I fell asleep. I was either sleeping in my sleeping bag or curled up in bed with one of my friends, but I was still in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, which made it obvious that it had all been real. Once more, however, I slept soundly and had nightmares about Tanya storming into the bathroom and stabbing me to death. I woke up with a start and my heart pounding, only to realize that I was still locked in but safe. At that moment, I heard the sound of cars pulling up in adult voices, and I felt a wave of relief that I cannot even describe. My friends' parents had finally come to pick up their daughters, and they had no idea how horrible the night had been or the worst. First of all, our cell phones were in a drawer in the living room when the incident occurred. We had decided to keep them off so they wouldn't distract us while we watched our favorite reality show, so we couldn't call them or ask for help in any way. Still feeling terrified and with my legs extremely numb, I went downstairs to the bathroom and discovered a completely bizarre scene. Tanya was sitting quietly on the sofa, talking to her mother as if nothing had happened, while the other girls were pale, and they exchanged nervous looks in silence. And, as ridiculous as it may seem, nobody discussed the incident with Tanya's parents. Instead, we all quietly gathered our belongings and left each of us with the burden of that awful night. When the sleepover had become a true horror story. Although this may sound very silly, the truth is that we never told our parents or anybody else what happened because we believed that if we did, they would never allow us to go to a party, sleepover again, and the truth is that we enjoyed doing this, but we never did it with Tanya again after that day. She also refused to talk to us, so we just ignored each other when we met in class. Nevertheless, despite the terrifying experience, I took away a valuable lesson from that day. People we think we know can be entirely different from what we think. My neighbor Stuart had always been an issue since he was a child, and I recall that the first time he had run in with. When he was 7 years old, he stole a bag of candy from the owner of the corner store for an adult. This may seem like a small thing, but he was already displaying signs that he was not on the right path. From then on, things only got worse, including fights at school, street fights, violent behavior at home, and a few small thefts that got him into more than one mess. His parents were at a loss as to why their son always chose the dark side, let alone what to do to change him. His father tried everything, including harsh punishment, therapy, and even medication. When he started hanging out with a real gang, it shocked everyone, not because he had no history of rebellion, but because he came from a good family in a quiet neighborhood with love and attention from his parents. He had everything that gang members don't typically have. They sent him to a summer camp to help him get straight, but nothing changed. Instead, he just kept getting worse and felt more and more drawn to the life of a bad boy. Decided to try to help him get back on track. So they set up a sort of family meeting where everyone, including the grandparents, gathered to talk to him one-on-one and told him how much they loved him and wanted the best for his future. At one point, it seemed like it would work, but Stuart broke down, sobbed, and embraced everyone. It was a heartbreaking moment. A few weeks before his 18th birthday, his family planned a large party, and they planned to reveal a surprise gift in the center of the celebration. On the day of the celebration, the neighbor's house was packed with guests, including me. Although we weren't best friends, we managed to work things out. The celebration began early with a lavish banquet and Stuart's favorite cake, strawberry and chocolate, and when it came time to give him his surprise gift, everyone was excited to see how he would react. His mother covered his eyes with her hands while his father led him to a large box. When his eyes were finally unwrapped, he nearly passed out from the sight of his ideal vehicle, a brand new Ford F-150 with a bright red bow on the hood, and his father handed him the keys. He then proceeded slowly to the tiled path that led to the street where the truck was parked. At that point, his younger sister Stephanie ran after him, eager to get inside first. appearing even more thrilled about the gift than her brother. When Stuart finally got into his new truck, he sank into those deliciously comfortable leather seats and caressed the interior as if he couldn't believe it was finally his. However, underneath that, there was a sense of tension because everyone knew that Stuart had been on the brink of a chasm. And even though that night it seemed like everything would change for him, there were a few people who questioned whether he could truly leave his life of problems behind. His sister Stephanie jumped into the back, bouncing around as if it were a trampoline. The celebration was at its height, and everyone was enjoying Stuart's birthday in style. However, in the middle of all that excitement, nobody noticed the black car slowing down in the street. Suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening noise, and bursts of gunfire broke the mood of happiness. We all threw ourselves to the ground, covering our ears as the sound reverberated around us, and glass flew through the air like confetti. When the noise finally subsided, we heard the screech of tires as the car took off at full speed. The scene was so horrifying that it felt like something from a horror film. Stuart's mother's heartbreaking screams echoed as the van that had once represented joy was now covered in bullet holes and surrounded by shards of glass. Stuart was lying on the pavement, his lifeless body slumped in a pool of blood, welcoming us to the sidewalk. Fortunately, Stuart was still conscious despite being seriously injured, and his life was slipping. As we watched the ambulance take Stuart away, his grandmother's mother came out of the house shouting Stephanie's name, and we remembered that she was the one who was missing. Through his fingers, we all pulled out our phones to call 911 in the hopes that the ambulance would arrive quickly. Finally, we heard the sirens, but while his parents were fighting to keep their son alive, the rest of us could only watch in shock and helplessness. Wasn't alone in the van. We all fled back to the vehicle as panic struck. But then there was a heartbreaking scream that left me with a memory that will never leave me. In the back of the van, Stuart's father was holding Stephanie's small, bloody body. Stephanie was only 9 years old, her skin was pale, and she wasn't moving. At that moment, we realized the tragedy we were facing, but every parent finds it difficult to accept what they see. Her father attempted to revive her, switching between compressions and breathing, but that just made things worse. Before long, he was covered in his 2 kids' blood and screaming in silence. The paramedics tried everything they could to save her while they were traveling to the hospital, but as soon as they got to the emergency room, the doctors confirmed what we all suspected had happened. Stephanie had died. Her parents' reaction was devastating. Her mother knelt down and CRI called out her daughter's name, while her father gave her a heartbreaking hug while sobbing uncontrollably. It was a devastating image that would stay with him forever. The police started questioning those of us present, but none of us knew who had carried out the attack or why. The days that followed seemed to go on forever, and the family took turns keeping watch, waiting, and praying. The doctors were unable to provide a clear prognosis, so Stuart had 3 surgeries in 2 days. Eventually, on the morning of the 3rd day, the doctors gave his parents some encouragement that he was going to recover, to survive, but the journey ahead would be lengthy and difficult. When Stuart woke up, they informed him about his sister. I wasn't present when they broke the news to him, but I can't even begin to imagine how terrible it must have been if Stephanie had been the person he truly loved. Their love was strong and pure, and their loss would mark him forever. After everything that had happened, Stuart turned into a true enigma, and the only people who were able to extract any information from him about what had happened were the police. He did what he could to help. Even though he didn't know the men who shot him, he had some suspicions about who they were, so he told the authorities everything he knew. The days following the shooting were chaotic, with news of Stephanie's death appearing in every newspaper across the nation. The authorities felt compelled to apprehend those responsible for this terrible tragedy. And after a lengthy and resource-intensive investigation, they were able to apprehend the car's driver, who turned himself in a few days later after nearly a year had passed. For his part, Stuart was able to heal most of his injuries, though he would always walk with a slight limp. Nevertheless, The guilt he carried for his sister's death would never go away, and he was honest with his parents about his connection to the gang. Later, when the trial came around, Stewart testified still using a cane, a constant reminder of everything that had happened. The two shooters were already on death row, waiting for their fate, revealing that he had been a member for some time, but had decided to leave just before the shooting. This was the penalty for leaving the group. After that terrible event, we began to grow closer at first, and I just wanted to support him. However, over time, we became good friends, and we now occasionally talk. One of the things that Stewart told me that I will always remember is the number he related about an incident with his father that changed his life when he was around 15 and still struggling with his issues. His old man sat him down he scolded him in the living room and said something that still bothers him today. You think you have everything under control, but what you've gone through so far are only little warnings. One day, the chickens will return to their coop and give you what you truly deserve if you persist in living your life. You may wind up in jail or, worse, dead, and your loved ones will be the ones who suffer the most. I could see in his eyes that those words torment him, and that kind of death itself must be less burdensome than burden.